Is this a good time for ethics? So within philosophy, ethics has been one of the most historically important topics. It's been a subject of reflection for every major figure pretty much within the history of Western philosophical thought. And in recent years, ethics has changed as a study within the academy, partially because the business of understanding morality has extended to include a range of fields outside of philosophy that had ignored the topic for the most part until now. So I think that's a very positive change. I think it's a great time for ethics because for the first time it seems that the entire academy is participating in the conversation. When I was a student, I studied every area of philosophy. I prided myself in having broad interests, but the one area I swore I would never study or work on professionally was moral philosophy. The study of ethics struck me as singularly uninteresting. It struck me as a little bit like self-help. It was full of sanctimonious advice about how to live a good life, and none of it particularly struck me as good. And in any case, it seemed evident that these were the opinions of particular individuals that didn't generalize in ways that I found especially useful. And I thought it was a syndrome of the study of ethics within philosophy that moral questions were narrowly construed as questions about harm. Is it okay to hurt people? Is it okay to restrict people's freedom or autonomy? These are big, important, interesting questions, but they're not the moral questions that I, as a person, face in day-to-day life. So moral questions in life are things like how should you behave with your friends? Who should you sleep with? How inappropriate should you be in mixed company? So all these questions that involve, even some political questions, what policy should one support, seem removed from these very broad questions about killing and letting die, and much more connected to aspects of life like diet, dress, sex, interpersonal relationships. In the years that followed my education, I became increasingly interested in interdisciplinarity and the idea that philosophical questions could be answered in part by looking at the sciences, and psychology, linguistics, neuroscience. All of these things struck me as extremely well positioned to answer philosophical questions. Philosophy seems like a very good field for generating questions and also for generating theories. So you can ask a philosophical question and come up with several possible answers to it, but testing between those theories often outstrips philosophical methodology. And this was especially clear in the areas that interested me the most, questions about the mind. So I was interested in how people think, how people process information. What is it to have a concept or an idea? What is it to have an emotion? And philosophers had given answers to all of these questions, but to really know what an emotion is or what an idea is, you need to look at how minds work, and you need to measure behavior, measure brain activity, measure thought using the methods of the social sciences. In those early days when I was looking at how philosophy could be illuminated by science, I had still systematically ignored ethics. And it is really only in the last 10 years or so that philosophers with that interdisciplinary bent have started to see morality as a topic of interest. And a number of things happened 10 years ago that made that transition attractive. One of the things that happened is the scientists themselves, who had been doing work in neuroscience and psychology and related fields, suddenly developed an interest in moral thought. And we find people thinking about morality and psychology since the beginning of that field, but they were on the margins, and a lot of them were doing developmental psychology or sometimes social psychology, but the people working in cognitive psychology who were interested in the basic laws of thought were less interested in those questions. That changed, and that changed partially because there were certain philosophers like Josh Green who began to do neuroscience after getting a PhD in philosophy. It changed in part because certain psychologists like John Haidt, a psychologist at the University of Virginia, published some results on moral thought that were particularly provocative to philosophers. And those of us who were working in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, took notice. And for myself, the transition was very natural because I had been doing work that was very connected to the Scottish philosopher David Hume. And David Hume was famous for arguing that all thought is based on experience. All thought is based on perception. And I had defended Hume's views about the nature of thought in some work. And I had ignored the fact that Hume also wrote a lot about morality. And for someone who thinks that morality is grounded in perception, for someone who thinks thought is grounded in perception, morality is a problematic case. Morality is very abstract. So what would a mental image of justice be? What would a mental image of evil be? And for the typical American these days, you might imagine, Osama bin Laden, or put Hitler on a screen and say that's what evil looks like. Or if you want to be a little more politically contentious, you could say Donald Rumsfeld's face, or George W. Bush. This is a picture of evil. But of course, that's absurd. When we decide that something is morally wrong or evil, it's not that we're picturing these faces of famously bad individuals. So what's going on? Hume had an answer to this. So Hume said, all thought is grounded in experience. The experiences that ground moral thought are experiences of emotion. And that idea, developed originally in the 18th century, suddenly made sense against the background of all this new science. And research was coming out linking morality to the emotions, and that was very connected to work I had been doing, so I joined the bandwagon. Now, some of that research is quite interesting. So you can show that if you put somebody in an emotionally evocative setting, it affects their moral judgments. If you put somebody at a dirty desk instead of a clean desk, they make harsher moral judgments than they would otherwise. If you show somebody a disgusting film, or have them recall some unpleasant event in their lives, or expose them to a noxious smell, they're going to make more stringent moral judgments. In some work I've been involved with, we've given people nasty beverages, and that affects their moral judgments. And there are all kinds of practical implications of this. So, for instance, if you're deciding, what to serve for dinner, you might want to make sure you don't have anything that's too sour or too sweet, or too bitter. Have lots of things that are sweet and pleasant tasting, and your guests will think more highly of you. We need to think seriously with respect to decision making in the real world about what people are exposed to emotionally in their environment before making those decisions. So a recent study coming out of Israel suggests that court judges are making decisions that are more or less harsh depending on whether they've just had a lunch break. And we can think about the physical spaces in which legislators and other policymakers make decisions and wonder, is the air conditioning okay in the U.S. Congress? Are people making these decisions when the sun is too bright? And it turns out all these things have an impact. Another study shows that when holding a warm cup of coffee, people are more likely to have positive views of the world, of other individuals, and to engage in pro-social behavior. One fairly old study showed that if you give people easy math problems, actually easy anagrams where they recombine letters to form new words, they're twice as likely to go door to door to volunteer for some good cause than if you give them more difficult anagrams. So behavior can be modified in dramatic ways by these emotions. So those discoveries have been filtering into philosophy. Philosophy, in turn, has been filtering back into the sciences. So suddenly scientists who've all but ignored philosophy realize that philosophers have come up with all these theories, and now for the first time we have this really rich marriage between philosophy and cognitive science and the study of morality, because the philosophers have the theories and the questions that are worth testing, and the social scientists have very good tools